dripping from leaves and within all heaves. His blessings to us who he trusts, that which has no color of its own, but makes everything glow on their own. The deep blue sea and the light green pea, the luscious pink hue of the flowers, enhanced by dew like rosy stars. It's time for us to do our due, to start to save when there's so few. Else there will come one day, it'll be gone, squandered this way, so protect it from all the squatter, that precious thing we call water. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the online lecture series on the occasion of the World Water Week 2021, organized by the Maharashtra Vriksha Samvardhini in association with SOAS, Goa University and BIF. I request Dr. Vartak, Secretary of the Maharashtra Vriksha Samvardhini, to give us an idea about the World Water Week.
Good morning all. Thank you all for your overwhelming response to this awareness initiative on the occasion of World Water Week 2021. This program is jointly organized by Maharashtra Vriksha Samvardhini, School of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, Goa University, and Bharati Agro Industries Foundation. Nature conservation through awareness and knowledge has been the primary activity of Maharashtra Vriksha Samvardhini for more than 30 years. Our objective is to create a strong interconnected network of nature lovers, educational and research institutions, and research scholars which can provide safety net for the conservation of nature and the environment. We want to be a bridge between the experts working in the environment and nature conservation fields and common man or society at large. It is with this intention that we have jointly organized the symposium for World Water Week 2021. For the next 7 days, experts working in diverse fields related to water conservation will share their rich experiences and knowledge. These will be further deliberated by a panel of experts in the concluding session of the program. Based on these deliberations, the panel will make concrete suggestions and recommendations to the concerned stakeholders, including governmental authorities. Thank you all once again for joining hands in this water conservation endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We are fortunate to have amongst our midst this morning the very eminent Professor Dr. Nitin Karmarkar, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the Savitribai Phule Pune University. Sir is a very well-known geologist in the field of igneous petrology. Sir's research has taken him around the world. He has a number of research publications to his credit. Dr. Karmarkar's work itself is a motivation to all working under the Pune University, as it shows us how one can blend academics, research, and administrative expertise. Without any further ado, I now request Dr. Karmarkar, sir, to please inaugurate this lecture series.
Thank you, Pramila. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. This August gathering, people from different walks of life, nature lovers who have joined for this particular seminar. We are celebrating the World Water Week 2021, and it is jointly organized by Maharashtra Vriksha Samvardhini, the Goa University and BIF. And we have a very wonderful speaker who is going to actually tell us about the Stepwell, the Vanishing Stepwell. It's a wonderful book that she has written. We all know it's a very scarce commodity, water. Fortunately, India being a monsoon country, we receive monsoon every year. But these days we have seen it is becoming very erratic in nature. Places where there is plenty full of rainfall are going dry, and the places where there wasn't rainfall, in fact, they are receiving plentiful of rainfall. So the distribution has become very erratic. And because of various different reasons, especially we all know that in most of the places, 70% of the agriculture to a great extent depends on the groundwater. And the groundwater recharging to a great extent has come under severe stress. These days we speak more about the not about the dug wells or the step wells that she's going to speak about. If you look at basically the ancient sort of history of India, the heritage sites, especially Dholavira in in Gujarat, basically, or the other places like Lodhal or Rani Ki Bav in Ahmedabad, all those are wonderfully created structures.
So I thank Dr. Karmarkar for whatever time he could give us. And for our first speaker this morning, we have the very renowned Victoria Lautman ma'am from the United States of America. To give us an introduction about ma'am, I invite Dr. Sanjeev Kalaswar sir, ex-director, Texas Water Development Board. Sir.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's my honor and privilege today to introduce our inaugural speaker for the World Water Week series of presentations, Victoria Lautman. Victoria has a seemingly unusual obsession, an obsession that she herself notes chose her, not her the obsession. It's an obsession for holes in the ground used for harvesting water. Rather odd, one might think, until one digs a little deeper and sees that these are no ordinary holes. These are sublimely pretty and beautifully engineered structures that were built many centuries and millennia, and there are literally thousands of them on the Indian subcontinent. Known as stepwells, valves, bowdis, or pushkaranis, they were built to collect water during the monsoons for use during the drier months of the year. Today, many have fallen into disuse and have begun to deteriorate, presumably because centralized water systems are very prevalent, also perhaps aided by the rapidly declining groundwater levels in many parts of the country. But their beauty and value as the architectural and engineering gems that they are slowly being recognized again, and a revival of interest emerging and restoring them to their former glorious states. Victoria is a recognized authority on stepwells. Author of the fabulously illustrated book, The Vanishing Stepwells of India, she has been an ardent fan of these structures since at least 1985, when she first visited India and fell in love with them. A bit more about her background. She has been a print and broadcast journalist for over 25 years, specializing in arts and culture. She received her undergraduate degree in anthropology and art history from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, a master's in art history from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and she also has a certificate in archaeology from the University of Oxford. She has worked at the Smithsonian Institution's Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, hosted long-running radio programs in Chicago, reported on the arts for several television outlets, written for dozens of publications, and lectured internationally on India-related topics. We're truly glad and honored to have her on this presentation series. As we kick off World Water Week, let us take a moment to learn about, reflect on, and appreciate the achievements of the people who left us these magnificent structures. Perhaps it will ignite a spark in us to do our bit to help preserve the memories and save these awe-inspiring structures from vanishing altogether, because it seems very unlikely that more will ever be built again. With that, I will turn it over to Victoria to tell us about her love affair with stepwells. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We are all looking forward to listening to Victoria, ma'am. I request ma'am to deliver her talk on Subterranean Ghosts, India's Vanishing Stepwells. Ma'am.
Thank you. Let me get this set up here and seem to be pulling up. Hold on a second. My desktop. So let me see if I can do this another way. There we go. Okay. Bear with me, please. Okay. Are you all seeing what you need to see?
Yes, we can see. Yeah, we can see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. I want to thank Sanjeev for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And also to Ajit for inviting me to do this. it's such an honor for me to be speaking to you. This is a little past my bedtime. I'm talking to you from yesterday. You're in tomorrow. But the idea that I could be talking to my friends in India, a country that I have loved for now 35 years, from California, where we're having a terrible water crisis right now, I just wish that I could be there in person to be with all of you. I've never been to Pune before, but I've been all over India. And I have seen over 200 stepwells throughout the country. But I have to start by saying, besides the thanks and the fact that I'm so flattered and honored to be doing this, I like to remind people at the beginning of this that even though I did write this book, and that's on the left side of the screen is a Stepwell in Jodhpur. That's the hardcover of the book that came out in 2017. And on the right is the soft cover of the book that just came out last year. I started this project as a journalist traveling in India, which is a country that I have loved. And I started going there for 3 months every winter, staying in Delhi and then traveling around the country to pursue various stories that I was interested in. I am not a scholar. I'm not a photographer. And Sanjeev had asked me about something he read about the type of camera that I use. This tiny little camera, if you can see it, this is the camera that I use to take photographs. I have no background in photography. I simply was somebody who was following a passion that I never in a million years expected to have. And I just want to sort of explain how that passion developed. I don't know how many of you are familiar with stepwells. I know some of you are very familiar. Some of you may not have been ever in a stepwell. Some of you might have experienced one, but not many. But regardless of that, I want to share with you what happened to me and why I decided that my entire life was going to get sidetracked into a type of architecture in your country that I think is so important that the entire world needs to be aware of it. And so I changed my life basically to accommodate that. When I first went to India 35 years ago, it was on an architectural trip, and we were in Ahmedabad. And at the time I was told, we were taken to this place outside of town, and I was told to go and look over that wall. There was no grass there at the time. It was in a very deserty, Gujarat, as you know, is a very deserty place. No trees, no tower. It really was a long time ago. And I looked over that wall and was absolutely astonished to have the ground disappear. I was not expecting to look over and look 5 stories down into the earth. That experience of looking over and down into something was the first moment that I felt the power of what stepwells were. We don't realize how much we take for granted the experience of architecture. We are trained to look up at architecture or look across at architecture, but we never get to look down at architecture. And so right there, I was encountering something that I'd never experienced before. I had never in my years in archaeology and in art history ever seen a reference to this type of architecture. And so I was completely mystified. I had no idea what I was looking at, but walking into the structure made it even more powerful. As if you've been in these, you're particularly in Gujarat, where there are these bridging elements and columns that tower over you. Suddenly I was very disoriented. My vision was going in different directions. I couldn't tell how deep this structure was, how long it was. And as I began to traverse down into the structure itself from the ground level, which is way up here, these are all subterranean, I was entering the earth. The sounds above the ground were getting hushed. That hot, bright sunshine of Gujarat became much more dim and diffuse. And the air went from being very hot to very cool and clammy. So that by the time I got down to the bottom of this stepwell, which was the Rudabai vow outside of Ahmedabad, I was absolutely, it was as though a transformation had taken place, looking up to where the ground level is up here. And that kind of a transformation, that powerful moment of going down into the earth and experiencing those differences in my senses was something that the people would have felt themselves 500 years ago when that stepwell was created. I didn't get around to studying stepwells for about another 20 years. I kept going back to India and traveling around the country. I just couldn't get enough of it. I really have an affinity for your country and I love it deeply. But it wasn't until I had enough time to go and actually investigate what stepwells were. That memory was so powerful through those decades that I understood or began to understand what it was that I had seen. And it was only at that point that I understood the connection of stepwells to water. Nobody had explained it to me. So most of you probably already know this, but in case you don't, I have to sort of treat you like the audiences that I speak to in America, where nobody's ever heard of a stepwell or seen a stepwell. And so I do have to be sort of basic, but I'll try and gloss over it. Of course, a shaft had to be dug down here to the ground level, to the groundwater, which I've seen stepwells that are 13 stories deep underground in order to reach that all important water source so that people could access it 24/7 all year long. So that in your dry seasons, they knew that they could walk down these stairs and always reach water. But then, of course, as the monsoons come and the groundwater begins to percolate down, then the stepwells begin to fill and these stairs submerge. It was an incredibly efficient system that lived on for 1,500 years, which made it all the more mysterious to me how something that was so efficient, that was prolific throughout this country and functioned so well, could have fallen completely off the grid of history. But I also discovered, that stepwells performed many, many more functions than just the primary one, which was to harvest water and have it ready for drinking, for washing, for watering your animals, for watering the crops, had many, many more purposes than that, which made stepwells, to me, the most multifunctional structures of their time. Of course, one of the most important functions they had, particularly for Hindus, was as subterranean temples, and many of them still function as temples today or as important sites for rituals and shrines. They also were very important civic centers, social places where people could gather in the community, a gathering place for the whole community. And in particular, I have to say for women, who we know it was their task and still is all over the world to go and collect water from the well, particularly thinking 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, when their lives were so constrained and still are in many cases, gathering at the well with other women would have been an extremely important social occasion. And you still see that today. This is a contemporary picture. And speaking of women and other important facets of the wells, they were very important as charitable gifts to the community. They were very, very expensive to donate one of these to the community. Somebody who was rich, powerful, royal, if they built this for their community, they were seen as a very benevolent person. And it's believed that some 25% of these were commissioned by women, royal women or wealthy women in their communities, generally to commemorate the deaths to honor their husbands. Both of these were specific examples of that. They were also very important on trade routes. If you didn't have a stepwell that was available along a trade or pilgrimage route, then people would not be able to travel. Simply, it was just as simple as that. This is one that I discovered in Gujarat outside the town of Dank. And this was a Rabari herdsman who knew that I was looking for Stepwells and literally ran through the brush to show me one that I would never have seen otherwise. And the minute he got there, he began to move away some of the debris on top that had fallen in and drank from it exactly as it would have been. This is from around 600 AD. So that's how it would have been treated, over 1,000 years ago. They were very important for cooling off. As you know, I don't need to tell you how hot it gets in India. Places like Gujarat, where it can be, well, in my language, it would be 120 degrees. It's just crazy hot. And when you get to the bottom of a stepwell, it can be 10 degrees cooler at the bottom than it is at the top. So being able to go into a structure and cool off was very, very important too. Later on, after Muslims came to India and began building them and bringing some of their own stylistic flourishes, there were entire arcades and and apartments like you see here, where people could literally hole up in the stepwells for days at a time if they wanted to. But in all the stepwells I've seen throughout India, the 200 that I've seen, the variety of them is just mind-boggling. No two are alike. They're like fingerprints or snowflakes. Each is as different from the other as you could possibly imagine. Just in terms of scale, some of them are very small and intimately scaled, while others, that's Rani Ki Vav, we just talked about that, are just unimaginably huge considering when they were created. Some were very utilitarian and almost no decoration at all, were just a simple structure set into the ground, while others were incredibly ornate. In terms of their shape, they even varied quite a lot. We see many that are just this very straight shotgun shape, just like a trench that's dug with steps to go to the water at the end, while others are L-shaped. You can see this one on the left is from Gujarat. The one on the right is from Rajasthan, outside of Fatehpur Sikri, actually. And nobody really understands why they were created in an L-shaped form. We thought, some people think it's a geological thing. Some people just think it has to do with land rights. Nobody has any idea. This is one of the problems of studying stepwells, by the way, is that so little material remains, so few facts remain about why these were built. I mean, who built them? Even the dates are often in dispute. So that when I was trying to do my research for the book, looking to real experts in the field, it was impossible. In my book, there can be 3 different dates, 3 different centuries attributed to the same stepwell. So little is known about them. There are lots of round stepwells, very beautiful ones all over the country, also square and then octagonal. After Islam came, this octagonal form began to appear in architecture. And then there's a form of stepwells which is completely defined by its pattern of steps and this kind of this steep shovel-like profile, and those are the kunds that you see. Often kund is incorporated into their name. And that was just a system of getting to the water much quicker, and it's terrifying if you've ever been in one of these to go down to the bottom. It's just, your heart stops. But you can always recognize a kund by its pattern of stairs, and it's really impossible to take a bad picture of one of these. There's some of the most extraordinary structures that you see in the stepwell world. Since you're geologists, and believe me, I don't know anything about geology, although I enjoyed studying it for 1 semester in college. Fascinating. Then it got too complicated for me. But geology played a very important role in stepwell design. And you can tell a lot about a stepwell's construction based on where it's located. For instance, the one Rajon Ki Baoli in Delhi. And Delhi has got this rocky, I think it's quartzite that is all through the land, and particularly in the Morali Archaeological Park. They're just these huge rocks sticking up out of the ground. So when these folks went to dig this stepwell, and this is often in dispute, the date, but they hit, you can see the rocks and the boulders that are just incorporated into this design. It's one of my favorite stepwells because they left those rocks in place. They could have probably chipped them away, but instead they decided to incorporate them into the actual design of the stepwell. Because it's so rocky there, all of these structures, stepwells, are rubble filled and then faced with stone. Whereas in a place like Gujarat and parts of Rajasthan, where the soil is just, it's so loamy, it's like clay, it's so soft. That's where you get these giant blocks of masonry, giant blocks of stone, and the walls had to be held apart with these often incredibly complex bridging elements like this, where you can't even really tell where you're looking, but just to hold the forces of the earth back. I was told by engineers that I'd consulted during my research for the book that it's much harder to dig down into the earth and try and keep the force of the earth at bay than to build up against gravity, that it's much, much harder. And in fact, we have no idea how many of these actually collapsed, probably a lot. But the very first stepwells that were built, these sort of incipient stepwells, before they became, before they were actually structural, were rock cut. We think that was between 300 to 600 AD. Nobody knows for sure. These are much later. These are in the Uparkot fort, very close to each other in Junagadh, Gujarat. And this, I just want to show you an example of what a rock cut stepwell would look like. It's simply digging into the ground, getting down to that water level as quickly as you can by stairs, any method you could. And that's what they would have looked like. Very, very simple structures. But then within just a couple hundred years, we got the first structural stepwells. The earliest ones that we know so far are in and around the tiny little town of Dank, also in Gujarat. This is where we have found these earliest examples. And you can see how simple these structures were and how narrow they were, very tentative about, digging them wide yet, and the little tiny blocks that they created. But even then you can see these were obviously Hindu stepwells with deities and niches in them that we see later on. I have to point out here that because you have an overabundance of incredible riches and monuments in India going back thousands of years, to somebody like me in America, which is a new country, our oldest building is like from the 1600s. It's, they're new by your standards. Like if we dropped a piece of paper in one of those old structures, some policeman would come and make us pull it up and then give us a ticket, and we'd have to pay for putting, the piece of paper there. So I was horrified to see, and these are the earliest examples of stepwell construction in Dank. First of all, nobody could tell me where they were. It was very difficult. I was with a really close friend of mine and a wonderful guide in Gujarat, Nirav Panchal. If you ever meet a guide, he's your man. And we couldn't even find this stepwell. And it was right there in the middle of town. These have become so insignificant to the communities who just don't see them as important that they could fill it up with trash and not even know where it was located, which drove me insane. But then within just a couple hundred years, the technology for building stepwells just blossomed. And as you can see from Chand Bowery, this is just off the road between Jaipur and Agra. And when I give this talk to American audiences, there's a lot of people who have come to India. We're just in a few miles proximity to this and never saw it because it didn't appear on any itineraries. It wasn't in guidebooks. It's beginning to change a little bit with this one. It's gotten to be a little bit more famous thanks to Batman, the movie, where this was used as the Batman, a prison in one or two scenes. And also it was in an incredible Tarsem Singh film called The Fall. It was only in it for 10 seconds, but still it made quite an appearance. But the idea that this can be so close to important tourist sites where millions of people go by and yet they miss it. I think this is one of the greatest structures on the planet and that everybody should know about it. And starting around 800, you get structures like this. It turns out that Chand is the deepest, one of the oldest, one of the largest stepwells built. And also, to my mind, one of the most extraordinary, because the early part of this stepwell from 800, built by the Hindu King Chand, this is typical of Hindu architecture at the time. There was no true arch or true dome in Hindu architecture. It wasn't until Islam came to India and brought in arches and domes and a couple of other flourishes that they combined with stepwells that you get forms like this. And so 1,000 years after King Chand built Chand Bowery, with the deity still intact down at the water level, the Muslim ruler in that region decided to build his own little, outdoor palace on top of it. And so you get this Islamic structure just slammed right onto the Hindu structure. The two together united two faiths across 1,000 years in this one space. And I find that absolutely remarkable. Well, after 800, stepwells did proliferate throughout India. We have no idea how many there are. People, or were, you hear, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. It's a guess. Nobody has any idea. They were everywhere, in cities, in villages, in forts, and because there's never been a real accounting of them, people are just beginning to start counting them now. We have a better idea of what's left, but not what might have been and what disappeared. But fort stepwells are among my favorite, just because they can be the most eccentric and the most interesting and the most ignored. This is at the Red Fort in Delhi, the most touristed place in Delhi, and yet very, very, very few people know or have ever seen the stepwell there. And one of the things that I really love about stepwells is that they are hiding in plain sight. Because they have no or very little above ground presence, you could just be walking along here looking up at a bird or a plane and suddenly fall into this structure because there's nothing to keep you from knowing that, from just going over the edge. There's no way of knowing what is there. It's a wonderful structure. It's not really L-shaped, it's more of a mirror shape. And you can see it was rubble filled and faced with this beautiful stone. What's very interesting about this stepwell historically, and I apologize, my photographs are terrible of this, but I did not know I was going to be writing a book. So if I had known that, I would have been paying a lot more attention to my photographs and figured out how to use my camera better and probably gotten a better camera and taken a photography lesson. Anyway, I didn't do that. But this stepwell, when the British Raj took over and, there were barracks built at the Red Fort and what have you, they decided to turn it into a jail, and they actually blocked in parts of this window, and you can still see the rails that they put in there, and used this as a jail for the freedom fighters before partition. And they were jailed there after partition when the British left. This was taken over by the British Army, was turned into a latrine. And then ASI took it over some years ago and really cleaned it up. I don't know what's happened with it. There have been some problems lately. At one point, they were talking about turning this into an actual museum to those freedom fighters. Last time I was in Delhi 3 years ago, that had not happened. Another one, though, that's hiding in plain sight that I love to show, because for Indian audiences, sometimes they have no idea that these are in their community. And a friend of mine came up after a lecture I gave in Delhi and said, I used to walk down that street. This is right near Connaught Place on Haley Road, and, really lovely shopping and residential area. And he said, I never even looked behind that gate. But of course, this is the now famous Agrasen Ki Baoli, which would have been on the outskirts of Delhi back when it was built. We don't know exactly when or by whom, but we think about 1400 AD. This would have been for people on their way into or out of the city. It's interesting that when I first saw this, I don't know, 8 years ago, it was really abandoned. There were never any people there. It was quite creepy, in fact, and always appeared on lists, maybe still does, of the most haunted places in Delhi or the most haunted places in India. And it, you know, with birds flapping around, it's dark. It was a little scary, but it's a fantastic place. But then, of course, you know that PK with Amir Khan came out in 2014, and the alien PK takes up residence and lives in this stepwell. And so ever since then, whenever I go to the stepwell, it's just filled with people. It was totally activated by that movie, which I think is lovely. I'm very glad for it. Another one that is very close to tourist destinations, and you know, people just don't know about it. And this is one of my favorite ones of all time, is the Nimrana Baoli. This is off the road between Delhi and Jaipur. It's just 2 hours outside Delhi. Again, this is one where I just can't imagine why something so big and so spectacular has not appeared in architectural books. It's just a spectacular thing. And that's exactly where I fell in love with stepwells. I was already interested in them from 30 years ago, but standing at that spot and seeing this type of architecture and the fact that it goes down 12 stories from, you know, this is ground level up here. It's very easy to forget. It goes down another 3 levels. We don't know who built this exactly. We think that it was probably some kind of drought relief for workers, but we don't know. I mean, nothing written. There are a lot of important scholars, though, in India working on this now. So I'm expecting a lot more material to come out of this. I just got the ball rolling, hopefully. Now, when you go down to Gujarat, that is where you see the oldest stepwells and the most ornate stepwells, because they're primarily the old Hindu stepwells survive down there. And yes, Rani Ki Vav is the queen of them all. I mean, I hate to use that phrase. It's also one of the only stepwells that we really know a lot about, because the dedication plaque to Queen Udayamati survived. How did it survive? That's a really interesting story. And we do know that Udayamati built this in the mid 11th century. And there's a fantastic out of print book by Kirat Mankodi just about this stepwell that talks about how he thinks that it took probably 15 to 20, maybe 25 years to build. Patan has no stone of its own. The stone was all brought from a mine 140 kilometers away, which is an important point, as you'll see in a moment. It was the largest, most grandiose, most expensive, most ornate stepwell ever built. And I have asked repeatedly people to give me examples of any architecture from the West, anywhere from the, well, specifically from the West, actually, because they're really snobby about this kind of thing, that is as ornate, as impressive as this from the 11th century. And nobody's been able to do it so far. This is a cut through of it. You can see, because this is in Gujarat, how huge these kind of buttresses, these bracing walls were to hold the earth at bay. They were just monumentally huge, this structure. But what we know is that probably about 100 years or so after it was completed, the water source, the Saraswati River, changed course and somehow busted through here in the wellhead and began to fill up the well with silt and mud and collapsed these walls. And it was basically left like that for about 1,000 years. When the British came and took these pictures in the 19th century, it was all filled in with mud. All they could see was the wellhead at the end. And it wasn't until the 80s when the archaeological survey started excavating it, that they realized it was like finding Pompeii. Everything had been so well preserved because of the silt and the mud that today, if you haven't been there, which I understand it's not all that close to you, but still, I mean, it is one of the most, spectacular places on earth. The carving and the detail of it is just, it's breathtaking. It is breathtaking, and became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, the same year that PK came out. Maybe there's a trend there. What's interesting when you look at these pictures of this incredible detail, and that, I just want to go back a minute and show you something. These pictures here of when the British, took this picture, and you can see that whatever was sticking up here, whatever columns were still sticking up, they weren't there anymore. And that's because they wound up here 5 kilometers away from Rani is the Bahadur Singh Kival, also in Patan, built by the man who allegedly owned the property that Rani Kival was on. And he just decided he needed a stepwell to irrigate his property. This is, of course, in the early 19th century. It's a crazy time to even build a stepwell, but you can tell how late it was because these domes are a much later invention that came to India, way after Rani Ki Vav. And so he just carted away a lot of what he could find at Rani that was above ground and stuck it into his stepwell. You have a much better sense of how a stepwell feels with going down into those different levels and seeing that level of detail and the change in your senses. You feel that much more in this stepwell from in a 19th century shell than you do in the original stepwell, which is completely open to the elements now. But if you look at these columns, you can see, yes, those were taken from Rani. And in a lot of cases, they didn't fit. So he had to actually add little plinths at the bottom. It's a fascinating stepwell, and a lot of people never get to see it, know it's there even. When Ahmad Shah founded Ahmedabad in 1411, and that was when there was a lot of architecture activity, and it's a really interesting period, architectural, and specifically for stepwells. Now, if you're familiar with any Islamic architecture, you know that the Muslims had a huge reverence for water architecture. They incorporated water into a lot of their buildings. They did beautiful work with water in their structures, but nobody had ever seen a stepwell because they didn't exist anywhere else than India and now parts of Pakistan. That was a uniquely Indian form. And when Muslims came and saw it, they really admired it. And even as other structures might have been torn down, there were edicts to leave stepwells alone, do not destroy them. And then they began building them themselves. And that started a whole tradition of Muslim-built stepwells. But for a brief period in and around Ahmedabad, around the time of Ahmad Shah, there are a number of stepwells built that look Hindu. They're still using all of the Hindu castes and the builders who were used to doing it for centuries, but they were building wells using Islamic ideas. For instance, using these true domes or the true arch or this spiral stairway. None of those existed in Hindu architecture before. This octagonal shape was used in Islamic structures, not in stepwells before this time. And there were actual benches on the other side so that people could rest and spend time in the stepwell. And importantly, as you know, you cannot use figuration, pictures of people in Islamic structures. So these niches where Hindu users of the stepwells were used to seeing deities, for instance, at Rani Ki Vav, here is the sleeping Vishnu. There's often a deity in the wellhead to bless the water. Instead, now there are these stylized images of flowers, or in another case, instead of, these figures of deities and and what have you are taking these floral forms like the tree of life, images that Hindus would have recognized and could still worship, but they weren't as blatantly Hindu. So you could see these wells and this type of architecture that was so beautiful, but was really a merging of two brilliant traditions of architecture and craftsmanship. And then it disappeared, just worked for about 50 to 75 years. There was another type of architecture, though, that came up out of that tradition of Islam. When Islam came and saw these incredible, what Hindu architecture had done with this type of water structure, they invented a different type of stepwell. All of the stepwells we've seen up to now have been very public. They were all out in the open. You could see exactly what was going on. They were generally for the public. But suddenly, there is a type of stepwell which is very internalized and very personal. It's the retreat well, which were often built for individuals. This is outside of Ahmedabad, a couple of hours. It was in a garden, pleasure garden, for, I think it was, he was a general, maybe a Muslim general. And this is for his family. You can't even tell that you're looking at a stepwell. It just looks like a slab of concrete. But when you go down into it, then on the inside, it's this wonderful place where the women could go and cool off. Water was brought to them in these rooms around the central core. The water could be hauled up here. I couldn't go in that room because there were bats screaming in it. It's very creepy to go in some of these wells. There's a lot of animals and snakes and things, ugh, bats, bugs. But I didn't go in that one. I just couldn't stand it. But this idea that you suddenly internalize the well instead of making it this big public access thing was a new idea. And the most extraordinary one of these is actually at the Agra fort. This is the Akbari Bali, that you would never think that there was a stepwell under that. And in fact, the man who was running the fort at that time had never been in before. And he might not have realized what that actually was. It's terrible to take pictures of this, but it's an incredible structure that plunges 7 stories down, built by Akbar. And this is the only way you can really see what's going on. This is one of the most complex, astonishing buildings ever built. Here is the ground level, right up here, right up there. And this is built in this almost spiral form. These are double-story rooms that were all frescoed on the inside. There's a set of stairs that spirals along to the top. And then there's another stair that goes straight out this way, which they weren't sure. They thought that was probably for Akbar himself. This would have been used for the royal family, the women of the family, completely away from people's eyes. And yet, you know, we would never know it was even there. Well, I'm always, I just can't believe that these things are so unknown, that people study architecture all the time and have no idea about these. And the book, which was very difficult to write, and which I didn't want to write initially, I decided what I needed to do was try and help raise awareness about them. And people always do want to know, but why did they disappear? Like, why don't we know anything about them? It's a very complicated question. I don't have the answers for all of it, but I do know that a lot of things happened at the same time. First of all, the breakup of the Mughal Empire starting in like the 18th century meant that there was not a lot of money to build stepwells anymore. They were very expensive, and people stopped building them right around the same time that the British really latched on in the Raj, hated stepwells. They were considered extremely unhygienic, probably destroyed who knows how many of them. We have no idea, but we know that they were destroyed at the same time that they brought technology and progress. If you build a village pump or a tank in a village and a woman can pump into her jars, why would she want to go and traverse 200 steps? I mean, it just makes sense. But then that disengaged stepwells from a lot of the social aspect. There was no reason any longer to go and gather at the well or even to keep the well clean. If you're using the well water that you're pumping in your village, why go and spend a lot of time cleaning out the stepwell? Even when there are stepwells that have important shrines or are used, some of the ones that are used as temples are still very clean, but a lot of the ones that just have shrines in them, forget it. People just stop paying attention to them. At the same time, cities began to grow up around these stepwells. This is the Madhavao in Gujarat, and it's the most extraordinary place. But it was probably outside like a town at the time. It wasn't surrounded, embedded in the middle of this town. It's very hard to even see it. I had to ask people to let me out onto their roofs and out their doors and things to even look at it. And it's not kept up very well, as you can see, in spite of the beautiful structure and sculpture there. Others, like this one in Kapidvanj, again, just completely absorbed by the city. You can't even see it from Google Earth. I had to send somebody there to get the coordinates in my book. This would have been an extraordinary stepwell. It had 3 entrances. Here's one, here's another one, but the town literally built on top of it, people taking the stone away and carting it off the way they did with Rani, so that you only just get like a shell of what it used to be. But then the water problem in India, as we know, I mean, that has contributed also to the death of stepwells. I mean, this very famous Raghu Rai photograph from the early 1970s showing Agra Sinki Valley when the water table in Delhi was like 28 feet below the surface, whatever that is in meters. I'm sorry, stupid Americans. But you can see how full that is. And now in Delhi, because of all the illegal bore wells, it's something like 250 feet down. Nobody will ever be able to connect that stepwell to its original water supply, although people are trying to do that in other places and have been successful in some. But until the bore wells and the water table is allowed to replenish, you're never going to get water back the way it was before. Some of the stepwells are still in use today, whether there's water or not. Mata Bhavani, which is from also the 11th century, built at the same time as Rani Ki Vav, a utilitarian, village well, nothing fancy here, but there's no water in it anymore. They have a hose filling up their pool, but the community decided to take over the stepwell, which had been, chained up by the government, protected by the government by simply chaining it up. And they decided that they wanted their temple back. And so it's been this very active temple for, I don't even know how long they've been doing it. It's a wonderful place to visit because it's very much like how it must have felt originally 500, what am I talking about, 1,000 years ago. But they added a lot of, contemporary sculpture and things and contemporary shrines to it. And I talked to a government fellow years ago when I saw it, who said, yeah, we have to get rid of that stuff. We want to close it down. Look what they've done to the place. And I had such an argument with him over it. It's like they are using that stepwell. It's an important part of the community. And this one on the right, from the same time, which has just been ignored and left to rot, like I think use these stepwells any way you can that keeps them in front of the public. That's how they will be saved. The ones where there is water, and there are plenty that still have some water in them, even if the stepwell is falling apart, you often find, people are pumping the water out for all different purposes, sometimes even drinking it, which I wouldn't recommend, but that's great. They're still using the stepwell in the way it was used so many centuries ago. And then there are contemporary architects who raise the profile of stepwells. We hope they do anyway. They try to, when they incorporate them into their own work. And this is in your own town. I wish I had been there to see it. I had to call a fellow at the Astronomy and Astrophysics Center to get this photograph for me. I'm dying to see it, by the now deceased Anglo-Indian Charles Correa, who often incorporated Stepwell iconography into his work. And Sanjay Puri, this is an unbuilt project on the right, a reservoir that he proposed for Rajasthan, and it obviously, was looking at Stepwell design too. The worst, most awful example of this is from Heatherwick Studios in England, an otherwise architecture firm I've always admired. This ungodly thing was built in Manhattan. It cost something like $200 million or more, I think, by the time they were done. Vessel. I actually wrote to these people and ranted at them about how they missed the opportunity to educate the public about stepwells by simply saying, this is called Vessel and it's based on Indian stepwell design. I mean, come on, give me a break. He literally stole the idea of stepwells and then turned it inside out and put it above ground. It really made me mad. And I used to give this lecture about showing this, saying that this was a terrible idea, that people were going to try and kill themselves, jumping to their death. Down here is the, in the bottom. And that's exactly what happened. They just closed it for good. The fourth person committed suicide, 3 in 1 year, and then 1 very recently. And now this $200 million project is just stuck there, this ugly behemoth. Sorry, I can't. Here's a good example of how people can transform them into something really positive. The Ravla Narle Lodge outside of Jodhpur has this beautiful old stepwell. They don't know anything about it, but they have cleaned it, and you can go and have dinner in the stepwell one night if you stay at their hotel, and it's just revived interest in it. Terrible photograph, but doing something like that where you reconnect it with people in a whole new way. It was just brilliant. And then of course the stamps that were issued, I don't think anybody knew about these. These sold out immediately to stamp collectors, but it was a great idea, that along with putting Rani Kival on the 100 rupee note, which I don't have to show you, but I do show it to my American audiences because I think it's so great that stepwells have been raised, their awareness is getting raised. But the best example of how transforming a stepwell and spending some time and money on it, what that can do to a community and how that can save stepwells is in Jodhpur. I took this picture like 7 years ago. I was walking by this stinky, disgusting, I could tell it was a stepwell, but I didn't know anything about it. I just took a couple of photographs, thank God. Thinking, God, that's just a mess, trash floating in it, right in the middle of the old town. The people that own this property and run a hotel back there, fabulous Ross Hotel, decided we're going to clean that thing out. It's grossing out our guests. They took away 500 truckloads of this kind of garbage from, I think, 300 years, 400 years of garbage was in this thing. It's from the 18th century. And this is Turji Kajalra, which is now the biggest tourist draw outside of the fort in Jodhpur. There are always people there. There's restaurants all around it. It's revived the entire square. You can go on the internet and see kids diving into it for money, and they have festivals there. And it was the most brilliant use of, spending some time, spending some money, but getting attention to the stepwell and transforming a community. This is the kind of thing that can happen and that I hope there'll be more of. And that's really the end of my talk. I cut out a lot, and I hope that it was still important for you. I'd like to show this picture because this is the first picture of when I went to Nimrana Valley and I was sure that I was going to die. I often feel like I'm going to die, fall down the steps into that and never be seen again. And I wanted my son, who was young at the time, to have a photograph of his mom looking happy one last time. So I had my nice Hindi speaking driver. It's like, please, will you take my picture? And that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, but I hope if you have any questions, you will ask. Thank you.
What a wonderful talk you have given, ma'am. And it's amazing that, we have so much of heritage sites over here in India, but then a lot of it comes under neglect, which is very unfortunate. And this goes to say that there's so much more that we as citizens of the country should, take interest in and work on it. So I'm sure that, I mean, your book and also this research, if we put it further ahead, it'll give it more interest to people, and they would work towards its conservation. I now request anyone who has questions, you can, the floor is open for it. So we can
Uh-oh. Oh, Pramila, sorry. We're having a little technical issue, but I would like to say something just because you made a great point just now. And it's something that I say in my lectures here. People always are saying, oh my God, there's so much garbage. How can they do that? This is terrible. And all I can say is that, yes, it's really unfortunate to see these incredible monuments with trash in them. But I also always point out that India is blessed or cursed with one of the most important histories that goes back further than many other countries, thousands and thousands of years, to Talavera. And I mean, you name it. You cannot possibly hope to preserve and take care of everything that you have in your country. There's too much of it. They have the same problem in Italy, frankly, in Greece. There is just too much that's too important, and you have more of it over a larger space. So I like to say to people that, given the limited amount of money that there ever is and manpower that can be devoted to cleaning or preserving one of these things, if there is a choice by ASI or whoever's doing it, INTOC, all these great organizations, to clean a temple or a mosque or a tomb or a stepwell in the middle of Delhi or Ahmedabad versus the most amazing one you've ever seen in Donk, in the middle of nowhere where nobody's going to go, then they're not going to be cleaning the one in Donk. And the people who live around the ones in Donk, who are very poor, trying to make a living every day, nobody has the time, the effort, the energy, or the will to go and keep their stepwell clean. I think it might help if there was garbage cleanup, if there were places to put your garbage other than the stepwell. But the other thing I always point out is that if you're in a place where there's no garbage pickup, the way, in a regular, somebody who's coming and picking up the garbage every day, every week, and you have a big pit next to you that nobody's using, throwing your garbage in that pit makes a lot of sense. It's better than throwing it on the, street. So I just want to speak up in defense of your country and conservation there. You've got a lot to deal with.
Yeah. No, that's true. But then, there are so many sections of the society that are working towards their own survival. So a monument will probably not be under their, interest at all. But then a little bit of community consciousness can help. And like you spoke about this Ervav in Jodhpur. So probably there was no organization that, worked to fund it or do the cleaning, but they did it themselves. So yes. There's lots of things
okay.
to do towards.
You're now in charge of that effort. I am anointing you, Pramila. It's a lot of work.
Definitely. Yes, definitely.
Pramila, I think there is no question.
Yes, sir.
No questions.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one question, if I may ask, Pramila.
Okay.
Yes.
Victoria, it was a fascinating presentation, and I think I have seen one or two stepwells in my life, but I think you gave us a journey across so many of them in India, and thank you so much for that. One question I wanted to ask is, in your interaction with the local communities, local people around, when you would have done that, what was your observation? What type of response they had in terms of both either the knowledge of that particular site or their feelings towards that, or their apathy or lack of apathy towards that?
That's a really, really great question. First, I would like to say that I was traveling pretty much by myself with a driver in most of the places. Every now and then I had my friend Nirav with me if I was in Gujarat. But most of the time I was traveling by myself. So the people that I interacted with were often very shocked to see me appear in these towns and villages looking at a stepwell that they couldn't care less about. You know, if I arrived in a town and started going to a stepwell, suddenly the entire town would show up and look around trying to see like what I was looking for. Like maybe I dropped something. They were generally mystified, confused. But I also must say that everybody was unfailingly nice and kind and helpful. And there were many occasions when I just knocked on people's doors and, you know, had to explain, can I go out your window? Can I climb up into the top story? And now if I did that, you did that in America, knocked on the door and said, can I come in your house and look out your window at whatever? They would call the police. They might shoot you, you know? But in India, people would say, come in, have dinner. Would you like to stay for the next 2 weeks? Unbelievably kind, lovely people. The only people, this other part of your question about what are people's feelings about that, if I could find somebody who was old enough around, they might remember swimming in that stepwell, or we used to go to the stepwell when I was growing up. But unfortunately, most of the time, the people that I saw really had no knowledge of it at all, didn't know anything about it. And that was sad, you know, but I think probably that's a lack on me. If I were Indian, if I had a good translator with me, if I really spent a lot of time going and asking people, I could have done a better job of that. But that wasn't my aim at the time. And I regret it. I'd like to go back and see if I could find people and get their recollections. But now it's up to another generation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question.
Yes, I have one little question. I am Professor Panaskar.
Yes.
In Maharashtra, in state of Maharashtra also, there are a few stepwells, and
Yes.
some are still they are maintained. So what do you think that these stepwells should be maintained properly?
You're saying, well, I am very sorry that I didn't see any in Maharashtra, because I've been to Maharashtra, but not while I was doing work for this book. But I know you're having a really great talk after mine, which I'm going to watch on YouTube, about the stepwells of Maharashtra. There's some wonderful ones in your state. But your question is, should they be maintained, the ones that are being maintained, or what? Tell me your question again, Professor.
Shall we go for maintenance of these stepwells for the different purposes or uses?
I mean, I think that I don't necessarily think that every stepwell needs to be maintained. I think it's a case-by-case basis. But I think because of India's water crisis, anywhere that you can go and get water and have a source of water the way they used to, I think that makes a really important case for maintaining stepwells. If there's a stepwell in a community and they don't need the water, or it's not very interesting, or it is costing too much for the community to do it, then no, I think that the community has to maintain the stepwell for years to come, not just for a couple of months. But in general, I think that the reason stepwell existed 1,000 years ago, that reason still exists. We need water. We need to preserve water. Stepwells are a great way of doing it. So yeah, I think they should be preserved. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Miss Nico, sorry, is somebody saying something?
One more question is there, I think.
Yeah, I was just reading that.
You can read, Pramila.
Nicole Sequeiras. Yes, sir. Ma'am, the question is, would step wells be a good way to recharge groundwater through rainwater harvesting?
Yes. I mean, I'm not an expert on water harvesting, but I have learned that one of the problems, for instance, in Delhi or in any really major cities where Delhi used to have 100 step wells at one point, but rainwater cannot percolate into the ground the way it used to because it's tarmac everywhere and buildings everywhere. So the problem with, the only way that you could get rainwater into a step well is by channeling it into the step well or by allowing it to percolate into the water, into the groundwater. And in order to do that, you need to have earth that is soft enough and available enough to allow the water to percolate in. I mean, the reason why there's so many floods in Mumbai or in Delhi streets is because there's nowhere for the water to go anymore. We have that problem here too. I mean, we sort of destroyed the system that was allowing water to get into the groundwater, into the water table. So I don't know that step wells, what basically the question is can we turn them into cisterns, not as a way to get the groundwater into the step well, but a way to get the rainwater coming in from other sources. Yes, they would preserve it up to a point, but it would also leach out again. So they're not the greatest cisterns, but they're better than nothing. I mean, the system that they had in place was groundwater filling them from the bottom to the top, and then they would gradually, the water would go down again. Rainwater is just coming in from the top. It's a very different system. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, good, because that's not my field.
Yes.
I had one question. Did you come across any kind of folklore or stories over there that the localites told you?
Oh, so many. And a lot of them, they fall into like two categories. A lot of the ones that I heard that you hear over and over again. One is that a witch or a monster or a ghost built the stepwell overnight. That's one. Another one is that the stepwell is connected by tunnels to this city or that fort or the Ganga. You know, there's lots of things about that. And another thing that comes up a lot is the idea of stepwells that needed human sacrifice in order to get the water running. And there's several, particularly the one Mada stepwell, which I showed you, which was from, I think, the 13th century. There's a song about it, about how when the stepwell was built, no water came to it. And a local witch, there's always a witch, told the town elders that there needed to be a human sacrifice of 2 young people, and only then would the water fill the stepwell. And the story goes, the song goes, that there were these newlyweds, they had just gotten married, and instead of going to their marriage bed, they went to the stepwell, and with each step they took into the well, the water rose until it rose over their head. They died, and the water was there. So you do get, there's a lot of these, you know, wonderful like folklore and myths, but they all tend to be the same kind of ones that are told over and over again. Good question.
Yeah, that's really wonderful because, really wonderful to hear that.
Yeah, some of them were quite funny, actually. Are there any other ones that people would like while I'm here before I droop off to sleep and you start your day?
Yeah.
No, I think, Vartak sir, anything else?
I think no questions, because she has given a
Right.
this thing about Stepwells, and very interesting lecture covering I think all the aspects regarding Stepwells, what is the role, then how to conserve, everything she has covered in the talk.
Well, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure talking to all of you. I wish I could be there in person, shaking everybody's hand one day.
Yeah,
I
sure,
hope.
sure. Yes, sure.
Thank you so much. I will now leave. I know you're
Yes.
going on to other talks,
Yes.
and it's a
Yeah.
wonderful conference that you've organized. And
Okay.
thank you so much to everybody.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Namaste.
Namaste.
Yeah. Good night to you, ma'am. Before we proceed with our next speaker for this morning, just a few pointers. All the lectures for this lecture series will now be conducted in the evening, and the link for which will be sent to you all, of course. Also, since Zoom has a limitation of entrance at 100, the ones who would not be able to attend the live session, you can see the recorded version on the Mission Devrai YouTube channel. So with that, we will now proceed with our next lecture. पुढच्या वक्त्यांचा परिचयासाठी मी डॉक्टर वर्तक सरांना विनंती करते की त्यांनी श्री रोहन काळे सरांची ओळख करून द्यावी. काळे सर इज असोसिएटेड विथ द महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल कॅम्पेन. Sir?
It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Rohan Kale. He did his graduation in Commerce and Diploma in Human Resources from Mumbai University. Presently, he is working in private industry. Last few years, he is trying to map, document, photograph, and conserve stepwells of Maharashtra. With this small introduction, now I request Mr. Rohan Kale to deliver his talk, Maharashtra Stepwells Campaign. Rohan.
First of all, thanks to Ajit Vartak sir for giving me an opportunity to present the Maharashtra Stepwells campaign in front of you all. I'll just share one slide. So Maharashtra Stepwells campaign, basically the local word is Barav or Pai Vihir. So Maharashtra Barav Mohim अंतर्गत आम्ही Stepwells, step tanks, Kund, Pushkarani, Pokhran, and the helical stepwells. We are trying to cover all these forms. Like stepwells, the local terms used in Marathwada region or the Paschim Maharashtra are Barav or Pairancha Vihiri. If you go towards Konkan side, you will find regional terms like Pokharbao, Ghodebao, Tali, or say Pandavkalin Vihiri. If you go towards Nagpur side, Vidarbha side, there they use terms like Baudi or Bauli for this. But they all are some kinds of step wells, basically. Then there are huge step tanks. There are kunds outside temples. There are pushkaranis attached to temples. There are pokhrans, and there are this helical step wells, like a round well with steps leading to the well shaft. So I'm trying to cover all this under Maharashtra Stepwells campaign. See, what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to lift this campaign from all the sections. Like we have so far mapped 1,475 stepwells, which include all these regional terms. So what we are doing is that we are creating a village to village mapping team of coordinators and trying to identify taluka coordinators. So what we would be doing is that along with the help of local heritage explorers, Indologists, archaeologists, and the respective village people, we would be mapping numerous stepwells on Google Maps. So what I've done is that I've created a custom Google map where you will be able to see only stepwells. For this purpose, I traveled across Maharashtra, say 14,000 kilometers on my bike. I did a solo ride. I met all the heritage explorers, the Indologists, archaeologists, a few geologists as well. Told them about this campaign, that why I'm raising this campaign because the reason is that the stepwells in Maharashtra are lying in the state of misery today. And to pull them out from the state of misery to the state of glory, everyone shall need to come together as one common team. It should not happen that somewhere someone is doing something differently. Here, Konkan is doing something differently, Marathwada is doing something differently. The purpose of creating one centralized database for Maharashtra, this is my vision basically. And then I'll just run you through each of the sections, like mapping and the documentation part. The documentation will happen on 4 fronts. The written documentation checklist, which will be a standardized checklist across Maharashtra. Like किती पायऱ्या आहेत, किती कमानी आहेत, मग देवळ्या किती आहेत, मग त्याचा आकार कसा आहे, एल शेप आहे का. आता महाराष्ट्रामध्ये काही 2 भागात मला एस किंवा झेड शेपच्या स्टेपवेल्स पण दिसलेल्या आहेत. प्रचंड संख्येत एल शेपच्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. त्याचा वेल शाफ्ट कसा आहे, काही ठिकाणी सर्क्युलर आहे, काही ठिकाणी ऑक्टॅगोनल आहे, काही ठिकाणी हेक्सागोनल आहे, काही ठिकाणी रेक्टँग्युलर आहे. मग ते काही भागात स्टोन बेलकप आहेत, काही भागात ब्रिक्स बेलकपच्या आहेत. सो एक रिटन डॉक्युमेंटेशन चेकलिस्ट असणार जी महाराष्ट्रामध्ये स्टँडर्डाइज असणार. त्याच्यानंतर येणार हेरिटेज डॉक्युमेंटेशन, म्हणजे ही स्टेपवेल कशासाठी बांधलेली, काय पर्पजसाठी बांधलेली, कुठच्या काळखंडात बांधलेली. Let the Indologists and historians club together and do this data, do this research. मग एक येईल आर्किटेक्चरल डॉक्युमेंटेशन. सो त्याच्यासाठी मी भरपूर कॉलेजेसना अप्रोच केलेला आहे. त्या लोकांनी पण हा महाराष्ट्र बारो मोहीम अंतर्गत सहभाग दाखवलेला आहे किंवा त्यांचे स्टुडंट्सचा पण एक अभ्यासक्रम होईल आणि आपल्याला पण ड्रॉइंग्स डिझाईन्स मिळतील. आर्किटेक्चरल डॉक्युमेंटेशन त्यांनी का होईल, आपल्या महाराष्ट्रात जेवढा पण मी फिरलेलो आहे, मी जवळजवळ 400 स्टेपवेल्स ऑक्टोबर 2020 ते मार्च 2021ला जेव्हा मी महाराष्ट्र दौऱ्यावर होतो तेव्हा मी 400 स्टेपवेल्स मी स्वतः पाहिल्या. तर तिथे मी काय पाहिलं की भरपूर स्टेपवेल्स या सारख्या आहेत, सिमिलर टाईपच्या आहेत. सो आर्किटेक्चरल डॉक्युमेंटेशन क्लब्ड विथ फोटोग्राफिक डॉक्युमेंटेशन will help us identify similar types of stepwells across Maharashtra. And then those which are in dilapidated condition can again be restored with the help of conservation architects in the original form. असं नको व्हायला की मी कॉन्झर्वेशन आर्किटेक्ट कडे गेलो आणि तो बोलला की अरे हे जुनं कसं दिसायचं आम्हाला नाही माहित, तर आम्ही आमची क्रिएटिव्हिटी लावून काहीतरी नवीन बनवतो. तसं नको व्हायला. We will help us identify similar types of stepwells across Maharashtra, 70% similar, 80% similar, 90% similar. And with the help of their documentation, architectural documentation and photographic documentation, पुढे जाऊन फंडिंग कधी पण येऊन दे, 5 वर्ष डाऊन द लाईन, 10 वर्ष डाऊन द लाईन, हे जसं ओरिजिनल फॉर्म होता तशामध्ये आपण रिकन्स्ट्रक्ट करू शकतो. मग प्रिझर्वेशन अँड कॉन्झर्वेशन. प्रिझर्वेशन ऑफ स्टेपवेल्स मध्ये पण मी हे पाहिलं की आपल्या 70% ऑफ स्टेपवेल्स अक्रॉस महाराष्ट्र ह्या जरी बेसिक साफसफाई जरी केली, कचरा काढला, आजूबाजूची झाडं काढली, तरी ह्या खूप चांगल्या राहतील वर्षानुवर्षे. त्याच्यासाठी काय करायला लागेल तर त्याच्यासाठी लोकल जे गावकरी आहेत, ग्रामस्थ आहेत, त्यांच्याशी बोललेलो आहे. सो दुर्ग संवर्धन संस्था आहेत महाराष्ट्रामधल्या, भरपूर अशा दुर्ग संवर्धन संस्था आहेत, त्यांच्याशी मी ऑलरेडी टचमध्ये आहे. सो आम्ही सगळ्यांनी ठरवलेलं आहे की हा पावसाळा जाऊन दे, मे बी डिसेंबर जानेवारीमध्ये पाण्याची पातळी थोडी खाली जाईल महाराष्ट्रभर, तेव्हा सगळ्या इथे ह्या बारव स्वच्छता करायला चालू करू, बारव पायविहिरी स्वच्छता करायला चालू करू. आणि त्याच्या पुढे जाऊन जसं लास्ट पॉइंटवर एक आहे की दीपोत्सव साजरा करणार आहोत. सो चौथा जो पार्ट आहे रिवायव्हिंग ऑफ स्टेपवेल्स. आता रिवायव्हिंग ऑफ स्टेपवेल्ससाठी मी स्टेट GSDA हेड जे आहेत काल शेट्टी सर, त्यांना जाऊन भेट दिलेली आहे त्यांची. मी त्यांना हा डेटा पण दिलेला आहे सगळा, टोटल 1475 स्टेपवेल्सचा. आणि लेट डेम डिसाइड, लेट डेम टेक अ कॉल की हा स्टेपवेल्स रिवाईव्ह करायच्या की नाही. इट वुड बी अ नीड बेस्ड. कारण आजकाल असं झालेलं आहे की भरपूर ठिकाणी घरात घरात पाणी आहे. येस, मराठवाडा थोडा दुष्काळीत भाग आहे, विदर्भ थोडा दुष्काळीत भाग आहे. त्यामुळे GSDA कडे ही अथॉरिटी पण आहे, दॅट इज भूजल विभाग. त्यांच्याकडे ही अथॉरिटी पण आहे की कुठच्या स्टेपवेल्स रिवाईव्ह करू शकतात, कुठच्या नाही करू शकत. कारण आजच्या डेटमध्ये असं झालेलं आहे की भरपूर ठिकाणी सेवेज लाईन्स किंवा ड्रेनेज लाईन्स पास होतात आहेत खालून. त्यामुळे त्याचं वॉटर अनालिसिस करायला लागणार आहे, एक पावसाळ्याच्या अगोदर आणि एक पावसाळ्याच्या नंतर. So this is actually a time consuming work as well. So this will be a totally a GSGA call. Let them take a call. Like government take a call की local ग्रामपंचायतीला करायचं का भूजल विभागाला करायचं. Last part is tourism development. We are identifying some unique stepwells across Maharashtra. त्याच्यासाठी मी डॉक्टर धनंजय सावळकर जे आहेत डिरेक्टोरेट ऑफ टुरिझम महाराष्ट्र गव्हर्नमेंट त्यांना ऑलरेडी भेट दिलेली आहे. त्यांना मी 3 प्रस्ताव ठेवलेले आणि ते तिन्ही अप्रूव्ह झालेले आहेत. एक होतं की प्रमोशन फॉर इनिशियल 10 स्टेपवेल्स ऑन दर वेबसाईट. आजच्या डेटमध्ये जर तुम्ही महाराष्ट्राची टुरिझमची वेबसाईट पाहिली तिथे कुठेच स्टेपवेल्सचा सेक्शन नाहीये. जसं फोर्ट्स आहेत, केव्स आहेत, टेम्पल्स आहेत, तसं स्टेपवेल्स सेक्शन नाहीये. सो तो इंट्रोड्यूस करायला सांगितलेला आहे मी. आणि मग इयर ऑन इयर ऍडिशनल 5 each स्टेपवेल्स विल बी ऍडेड ऑन दॅर वेबसाईट इयर बाय इयर. कारण त्याचा अभ्यास पण करायला लागणार आहे. माझ्या साईडून ऑलरेडी 10 स्टेपवेल्सचा डेटा लास्ट वीक मध्ये त्यांना मी ईमेल केलेला आहे. सो सप्टेंबरमध्ये त्यांची काहीतरी वेबसाईट रिवॅम्प होणार आहे. तेव्हा तुम्हाला प्रत्येकाला तिथे स्टेपवेल्स दिसतील त्या भागात. आणि नंतर येस ऑन द डे ऑफ महाशिवरात्री नेक्स्ट इयर इन इयर 2022 वी विल बी सेलिब्रेटिंग महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल दीपोत्सव. म्हणजे जे वर्षानुवर्षे काळाच्या ओघात नष्ट होत चाललेल्या बारव आहेत, पायविहिरी आहेत, त्या सगळ्या अशा उजाळून काढायच्या आहेत, दिव्यांनी लख्ख करून टाकायच्या आहेत. मग आम्ही ऍक्च्युली गुढीपाडव्याच्याच दिवशी हे करणार होतो या वर्षी, पण आपल्या इथे लॉकडाऊन झालं आणि हे करता नाही आलं. माझ्याकडे 100 गावांचा होकार होता. आज माझ्याकडे जवळजवळ 100 ते 150 गावांचा होकार आहे की त्यांच्या भागातली राईट अप टू विदर्भ, मराठवाडा, उत्तर महाराष्ट्र, कोकण, दक्षिण महाराष्ट्र, पश्चिम महाराष्ट्र, ह्या सगळ्यांकडनं मला होकार आहे की महाशिवरात्रीच्या दिवशी आपापल्या राज्यातील आपल्या भागातील स्टेपवेल ह्या दिव्यांनी सजवल्या जाणार आहेत. आणि त्याच्या अगोदर जानेवारी फेब्रुवारी या सगळ्या स्वच्छता पण करण्यात येणार आहे. सो त्याचं रिझन काय आहे की महाशिवरात्रीच का, असं मला भरपूर लोकांनी विचारलं, दिवाळी किंवा दशेरा का नाही. त्याचं रिझन असं आहे की भरपूर ज्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत त्या एका महादेव मंदिराच्या परिसरात बांधलेल्या आहेत किंवा मग आपल्या शिवपिंडीच्या आकाराच्या आहेत. आणि मार्च इज द राईट टाइम जिथे पाण्याची पातळी खाली जाते. त्यामुळे जे स्वच्छता करायची असेल तर ती आतमधून प्रॉपर वेनी ती स्वच्छता करण्यात येईल. सो हे हा एक टोटल प्रेझेंटेशन अबाउट महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल्स कॅम्पेन. So what I'm trying to tell each and everyone is that everyone will have to play its respective role. जसं आमची मॅपिंग टीम असणार आहे तसं इंडोलॉजिस्ट अँड हिस्टोरियन्स will have to step forward and say that yes, we are taking up the responsibility of heritage documentation. The photographers will have to take up the responsibility for photographic documentation. The numerous architectural colleges across Maharashtra, we will go in collaboration with them and try to do the architectural documentation. The preservation of stepwells, the local people, Durga Samvardhan Samstha and NGOs will do. The conservation architects will play a role for the conservation of stepwells, reconstruction of stepwells. The reviving stepwells will be under GSGA. So to make this campaign a sustainable campaign, the respective authority I have mentioned here, the state archaeology department च्या खाली जर हे रन केलं मॅपिंग अँड डॉक्युमेंटेशन, इट विल बी सस्टेनेबल. पुढे जाऊन जर रोहन काळे ह्या प्रोजेक्ट मध्ये नसेल तरी लोकांना माहित असायला पाहिजे की काय करायचं. सो वी विल बी ट्राईंग टू क्रिएट फ्रेमवर्क्स, प्रोसेसेस अँड अ प्रोसेस फ्लो बेसिकली फॉर ईच अँड एव्हरी सेक्शन. आर्किओलॉजी डिपार्टमेंटचे जे हेड आहेत डॉक्टर तेजस गर्गे सर, त्यांच्यासोबत ऑलरेडी या प्रोजेक्ट बद्दल त्यांचा पण पाठिंबा आहे. स्टेट गॅझेटियर हेडचे जे आपले स्टेट गॅझेटियर हेड जे आहेत दिलीप बलसेकर सर, त्यांच्यासोबत पण बोललेलो आहे. सो प्रत्येक सेक्शनचे फ्रेमवर्क्स अँड प्रोसेसेस क्रिएट करणार आहोत नेक्स्ट इयर पासून. आता कोविड टाइम आहे म्हणून एवढं काही अग्रेसिव्हली करत नाही आहोत या ह्याच्यावर. सो नेक्स्ट इयर पासून फ्रेमवर्क्स प्रोसेसेस एस्टॅब्लिश करून दिस महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल्स कॅम्पेन विल रन इन अ व्हेरी प्रॉपर स्ट्रक्चर्ड मॅनर अक्रॉस द इयर्स. हे आहे एक्झॅक्ट मॅपिंग ऑफ स्टेपवेल्स. जसा तुम्हाला हा महाराष्ट्र मॅप दिसतोय आज, म्हणजे एक 1 year डाऊन द लाईन ऑक्टोबर 2020 ला हे प्रोजेक्ट लॉन्च केलेलं आहे महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल्स कॅम्पेन. त्याच्या अगोदर प्रत्येकाला फक्त बेसिक त्याच्या गावापुरतंच माहित होतं, पण कुठेच सेंट्रलाइज डेटाबेस नव्हता महाराष्ट्रामध्ये की किती एक्झॅक्टली आहेत, कुठे आहेत. जसं घाटवाटांमध्ये बांधलेले आहेत, आपल्या राज्य मार्गावर बांधलेले आहेत, स्टेट हायवेजवर बांधलेले आहेत, गडकिल्ल्यांच्या परिसरात आहेत, मंदिरांच्या परिसरात आहेत. मग पुण्यापासून तुळजापूर, पुण्यापासून पंढरपूरला जो यात्रा रूट्स आहेत, शिखर शिंगणापूरचा जो यात्रा रूट आहे त्याच्या परिसरात जवळजवळ 7-8 आहेत. अशा वेगवेगळ्या ठिकाणी आपल्याला ऍक्च्युअली फाइंड आउट करायला करत घेतलेल्या आहेत की कुठे कुठे बांधलेल्या आहेत, कशासाठी बांधलेल्या, या महामार्गावरच्या आहेत का, घाटवटावरच्या आहेत का, गडकिल्ल्यांच्या परिसरातल्या आहेत. सो इफ यू कॅन गो टू माय वेबसाईट www.indianstepwells.com, त्याच्यामध्ये व्हेरी क्लिअरली इन्स्ट्रक्शन्स लिहिलेले आहेत की हा मॅप कसा वापरायचा. द मोस्ट युनिक अँड द मोस्ट इंटरेस्टिंग पार्ट ऑफ दिस मॅप इज दॅट वन्स यू फॉलो द प्रोसेस, एक लिंक आहे, त्या लिंकवर तुम्ही क्लिक केलात की टोटली 1485 स्टेपल्स आतापर्यंत ज्या मॅप झालेल्या आहेत त्या ऑटोमॅटिकली तुमच्या गुगल मॅप्सवर येऊन स्टोर्ड होणार, तुमच्या रिस्पेक्टिव्ह गुगल मॅप्सवर मोबाईलच्या. एव्हरी टाइम आय अपलोड एनी न्यू स्टेपवेल इन इट ऑटोमॅटिकली गेट्स रिफ्रेश्ड अँड अपडेटेड इन युअर रिस्पेक्टिव्ह गुगल मॅप्स. असे माझे भरपूर मित्रमंडळी आहेत ज्यांनी, मी ओरिजिनली जेव्हा फक्त 150-200 स्टेपवेल्सवर होतो तेव्हा ही प्रोसेस रन केलेली. आज प्रत्येकाच्या गुगल मॅपवर हे एवढे अपडेटेड स्टेपवेल्स दिसतात. कुठच्या पण एका स्टेपवेलवर क्लिक करा, जिथे पण आम्ही फोटो उपलब्ध करून दिलेला आहे, जवळजवळ एक 700-750 जागांवर फोटो उपलब्ध करून दिलेले आहेत. सो ते तुम्हाला बघायला मिळतील की ते फोटो कसा दिसतो, ती स्टेपवेल कशी दिसते. अँड यू जस्ट हॅव टू हिट ऑन द डिरेक्शन बटन. डिरेक्टली रूट मॅप चालू होणार आहे. तुम्हाला गावात कोणालाही विचारायला नको की ती स्टेपवेल कुठे आहे. डायरेक्ट स्टेपवेलचं जे स्थान आहे तिथे जाऊन तुम्ही पोहोचाल. सो हे एक युनिक हे आहे. आता मी तुम्हाला अजून एक स्लाइड दाखवतो जिथे महाराष्ट्राच्या स्टेपवेलचे फोटोज आहेत. There are amazing stepwells in Maharashtra, but like no one ever imagined that there are some huge stepwells. जसं धुळ्याला रिसेंटली 2 महिन्या अगोदर 3-5 मजली स्टेपवेल्स लोकेट केलेले आहेत. मग नाशिक साईडला पण एक आहे जी 5 मजली स्टेपवेल आहे, नाशिक जिल्ह्यात मुल्हेड साईडला. मग विदर्भामध्ये एक अमरावती साईडला एक 5 मजली स्टेपवेल आहे. सो आय विल जस्ट टेक यू थ्रू द फोटोज ऑफ स्टेपवेल्स. सो दिस आर स्टेपवेल्स इन साऊथ कोकण, रायगड, रत्नागिरी, सिंधुदुर्ग. मी प्रत्येकाचं नाव पण लिहिलेलं आहे कुठे कुठे या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. सो ह्या सगळ्या जांभ्या दगड किंवा चिरा दगडातून कोरलेल्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत कोकणातल्या स्पेसिफिकली. जसं हे तुम्हाला दिसतंय भोकेची स्टेपवेल आहे किंवा नखरेची स्टेपवेल आहे. ही ऑलमोस्ट लाईक 35-40 स्टेप्स आर देअर ज्या खाली जातात अँड वेल शाफ्टला लीड करतात. गणेश गुहेची पण स्टेपवेल जी आहे ती विड्थ मध्ये फक्त 5 फूट आहे, फक्त 5 फूट विड्थ मध्ये. आणि अशा दगडातून कोरलेल्या जवळजवळ 40 ते 45 स्टेप्सच्या आतमध्ये जाणाऱ्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. या मडेघाटची स्टेपवेल आहे महाडची. रानवाडी खुर्द म्हणून आहे तिथे, रानवाडी खुर्द म्हणून त्या गावातली आहे. मडेघाट जे बोलतात, वरतून जर तुम्ही खाली येत असाल कोकणात, सो ही मडेघाटातली एक स्टेपवेल आहे. या काही स्टेपवेल्स आहेत ज्या पालघरला आहेत. पालघरला पण रिसेंटली आता एक टीम आहे तिथे आयडेंटिफाय केलेली आहे. 3-4 लोक आहेत ज्या ऑलमोस्ट लाईक वीक मधून 1-2दा तरी अपडेट करत असतात स्टेपवेल्स. There are amazing stepwells in पश्चिम महाराष्ट्र, पुणे आणि अहमदनगर मधल्या. सो ही मल्लिकार्जुन महादेव टेम्पल लोणी भापकर आहे, तिथे पुष्करणी आहे, बारवका पुष्करणी आहे, ते आयडेंटिफाय करू आपण नंतर. सो बल्लाळेश्वर मंदिर आहे जेजुरीला, तिथे एक आहे स्टेपवेल. जुन्नरला खंडोबा मंदिर आहे, डोंगरावर आहे, तिथे एक हे लोकांना एक स्टेपवेल मिळालेली आहे. रिसेंटली लोकेट झालेली आहे 6 महिन्या अगोदर. ही बाणेश्वर मंदिर आहे तळेगाव दाभाड्यांची, त्यांच्या खाजगी मालकीची आहे. तिथे एक स्टेपवेल आहे, मंदिराच्या लगत बाजूलाच आहे. मनसरची स्टेपवेल आहे. ही मलखन राजवाड्याची जी स्टेपवेल आहे ना त्याचा स्पेसिफिक उल्लेख करीन. जसं विक्टोरिया मॅडमनी बोलली नीरव. सो नीरव हा माझा पण खूप चांगला मित्र आहे. त्याच्यासोबतच कपिल ठक्कर म्हणून आहे गुजरातचा. सो त्यांच्यासोबत मी टच मध्ये आहे गुजरातमधून. ते दोघंही स्टेपवेल एक्सप्लोरर्स आहेत त्या भागातले. त्यांच्या साईडला मी स्वतः पाहिलेली एक हलिसा म्हणून जागा आहे गांधीनगर मध्ये, तिथे अशी हुबेहूब डिक्टो स्टेपवेल आहे. हलिसास मध्ये. आणि अजून एक आहे वडच का काहीतरी जागा आहे बरोड्याच्या जवळ, बरोडा सिटीपासून हार्डली फ्यू किलोमीटर्स मध्ये. तिथे अशा 2 सिमिलर टाइप्स ऑफ स्टेपल्स आहेत ज्या मलकन राजवाड्याला मॅप करतात, स्टेम आहेत. सो आतापर्यंत मी जेवढे फोटोज पाहिलेले आहेत किंवा जेवढ्या स्टेपल्स बद्दल ऐकलेलं आहे, सो ह्या टाइपच्या स्टेपल्स एक पूर्ण इंडियाभर एक मोजक्याच आहेत, एक 10 वगैरेच असतील. या काही अहमदनगर साईडच्या आहेत. सो अहमदनगरला पण आणि मराठवाडा हा यादव डॉमिनेटेड होता. 12-13 सेंचुरीमध्ये प्रचंड संख्येत यादवांनी त्या राज्यात मराठवाडा आणि थोडंफार अहमदनगर साईडला यादवकालीन स्टेपल्स मिळतील तुम्हाला. सो ही बेलवंडी कोठारची जी स्टेपल आहे श्रीगोंदा, आमचा असा अंदाज आहे की ती यादवकालीन किंवा राष्ट्रकूटांनी बांधलेली आहे. इवन रांजणगाव मस्जिदची जी आहे ती व्हेरी सिमिलर टू यादवकालीन टाईप स्टेपल्स आहे. ही हत्ती बारव आहे अहमदनगरची. ब्राह्मणी स्टेपल आहे. अगेन जर तुम्ही बघाल तिथे सिमिलॅरिटी खूप दिसेल तुम्हाला. म्हणजे 1 साइडहून किंवा 3 साइडहून एंट्रन्स असतात आणि एका साइडला मंडप असते बेसिकली, विच स्टँड्स ऑन 4 पिलर्स. So this is very similar to the Yadav-Kalin type stepwell, which is built in the 12th to 13th century. निगोजची स्टेपल आहे, विच इज अ 3 एंट्रन्स स्टेपल. ही रत्नेश्वर मंदिरातली आहे. एक मेजर एंट्रन्स आहे आणि एक बाजूने एक एंट्रन्स आहे. हे रतनगड ट्रेक जर तुम्ही करत असाल कधी तर त्याच्या पायथ्याशी अमृतेश्वर मंदिर आहे आणि त्याच्या बाजूला ही स्टेपल आहे. ही ती मी बोलत होतो धुळे मधली 5 माळी स्टेपल आहे. 5 माळी तुम्हाला व्हेरी क्लिअरली दिसते इथे 5 मजली स्टेपल आहे. सो अहिल्यापूर आहे आणि अहिल्या महाराणी अहिल्याबाई होळकरांनी ही बांधलेली आहे स्टेपल. साधारण एक 18th सेंचुरी मधली असेल ही स्टेपल. सो अशा धुळेमध्ये क्लोज बाय धुळे डिस्ट्रिक्ट मध्ये 3 लोकेट झालेले आहेत 5 मजली स्टेपल्स, पण खूप वाईट अवस्थेत आहेत. ऑलमोस्ट लाईक लोकल विलेजर्सना थोडा जनरेट अवेअरनेस करून त्या लोकांची मदत घेऊन तिकडच्या दुर्ग संवर्धन संस्थांची मदत घेऊन ही थोडी फार स्वच्छता करायला लागणार आहे. नाही तर एवढ्या चांगल्या स्टेपल्स आपण नष्ट होतील. ही ती अजून एक आहे जी धुळेमधली जी मी बोललो 5 मजली स्टेपल आहे. इट इज अ कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ ब्रिक्स प्लस स्टोन्स. या काही नॉर्थ महाराष्ट्र मधल्या स्टेपल्स आहेत. धोडपची किल्ल्यावरती आहे स्टेपल. सो इमॅजिन धोडप किल्ल्यावरती एवढी आतमध्ये किल्ल्याच्या वरती अशी दगड चिरून ही बांधलेली आहे, खणून ही बांधलेली आहे स्टेपल. ही निफाड तालुका आहे त्याच्यामध्ये निताळेची स्टेपल आहे. निताळे गावातली ही एल शेप स्टेपल आहे विथ चेंबर्स आहेत. लेफ्ट साइडला जर तुम्ही पाहिलं तर तिथे चेंबर्स आहेत. ही मंगरुळची स्टेपल आहे. प्रॉपर 3 लेयर्स ऑफ लँडिंगची स्टेपल्स आहे विथ 2 एंट्रन्सेस याच्यात. ही आहे स्टेपल्स इन साऊथ महाराष्ट्र, म्हणजे पन्हाळा किल्ल्यावरची एक 3 मजली अंधारबाव बोलतात ती आहे. दातेगडची स्टेपल ह्याचा स्पेसिफिक मेन्शन करीन, अशी स्टेपल पूर्ण भारतात कुठेच नाही आहे. ती खाली तुम्ही गेलात तर ही तुम्हाला तलवाराच्या आकाराची स्टेपल दिसेल. हा जो शेप पाहिला तर ती तलवाराच्या आकार सेम डिक्टो 100% तलवाराच्या आकाराची स्टेपल आहे. पूर्ण भारताभर कुठेच नाही मिळणार. आवर्जून जाऊन बघा. दातेगड वरती चढायला हार्डली 30 मिनिट्स टू 45 मिनिट्स लागतील, पण एकदा जाऊन बघा नक्की. ही करमाळ्याची 96 पायऱ्यांची स्टेपल आहे सोलापूरची. मराठवाडा मी स्पेसिफिकली मेन्शन करीन. मला मराठवाड्यामधल्या स्टेपल्स प्रचंड आवडल्या. म्हणजे मॅक्झिमम तिथे सगळ्या यादवकालीन स्टेपल आहे. चारथानाची यादवकालीन आहे. पिंगळेश्वर मंदिर आहे तिथे, महादेव मंदिर आहे त्याच्या समोरच ती स्टेपल आहे. सो ही पिंगळीची अगेन यादवकालीन स्टेपल आहे. आरवीची जी स्टेपल आहे 3 बाजूने एंट्रन्स आहे, एका साईडला मंडप आहे, ती पण इथे यादवकालीन स्टेपल आहे. नागनाथ मंदिराच्या जीर्णोद्धार केलेला 12व्या शतकात त्याचा एक शिलालेख आहे तिथे. रायपूरची स्टेपल आहे ती पण सुंदर आहे. भांडेश्वर मंदिराची जी स्टेपल आहे ती गावाच्या थोड्याशा बाहेर एका शेतात आहे. या परत मराठवाड्यामधल्याच आहेत. औरंगाबाद, जालना, परभणी, हिंगोली ह्या सगळ्या आहेत. वेरूळची स्टेपल आहे औरंगाबाद पासून काही अंतरावर. पराडगावला स्टेपल आहे. देवगिरी किल्ल्याच्या आतमध्ये 2 स्टेपल्स आहेत. एंटर केल्या एक लेफ्ट साईडला एक राईट साईडला आहे. ही मोठी एक आहे लिटरली. ही ऑलमोस्ट एक 3 ते 4 माळ्याची स्टेपल आहे देवगिरीची. चोंदळा म्हणून आहे औरंगाबाद साईडला, तिथे 3 मजली स्टेपवेल आहे. 3 लेयर्स ऑफ लँडिंग्स आहेत बेसिकली. जागजी आहे उस्मानाबाद, अतिशय सुंदर आणि फुल्ली इंटॅक्ट स्टेपवेल आहे. पारंग्या किल्ल्यामधली परत तुम्ही पाहिलं तर अशी गोल आकाराची आहे, आतमध्ये चेंबर्स आहेत. हे परत मराठवाड्यामधली आहे. बाचेगाव म्हणून आहे जालनामधली. ही स्पेसिफिकली मी मेन्शन करीन कारण बाचेगावची जी एक स्टेपवेल आहे ती आणि आपल्या साताऱ्याची गुडसळे गावातली एक स्टेपवेल आहे, त्या ऑलमोस्ट 80% सिमिलर आहे. सो हे मी म्हणत होतो, जेव्हा आर्किटेक्चरल डॉक्युमेंटेशन जेव्हा करू, इट विल हेल्प अस आयडेंटिफाय सिमिलर टाइप्स ऑफ स्टेपवेल्स अँड रिकन्स्ट्रक्ट करू शकतो. वाघरुळीला खूप मोठी स्टेपवेल आहे, बाजूला समाधी आहे. अंबडची पोखरणी आहे, मोठा पोखरण आहे अंबडला. हे वेस्ट विदर्भ मधल्या स्टेपवेल्स आहे. इथे तर प्रचंड मोठ्या आहेत त्या स्टेपवेल्स, म्हणजे ऑलमोस्ट लाईक 3-3 मजल्याच्या बिल्डिंग्स केवढ्या वाटतात तशा. ही बागाची विहीर जी आहे सातारगावची, ती प्रायव्हेट मालकीची आहे. सो तिथे जर जायचं असेल तर त्याच्या बाजूलाच त्यांचा ओनरचं घर आहे, त्यांना रिक्वेस्ट करा आणि मग तिथं आतमध्ये जा तुम्ही. ही 3 मजली आहेत आणि त्याचा आकार जर तुम्ही पाहिलात तर दिल्ली आणि राजस्थानच्या ज्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत त्याच्यासारख्याच आहेत. व्हेरी सिमिलर टू स्टेपवेल्स इन दिल्ली आणि राजस्थान. पिंजरची मोठी स्टेपवेल आहे. बार्शी टाकळीची खूप सुंदर होती स्टेपवेल आणि त्याच्या ओनरनी पण ती खूप चांगली ठेवलेली. तो प्रत्येक वीकला ती साफसफाई करतो त्या स्टेपवेलची. सो इथे आतमध्ये चेंबर्स पण आहेत. ह्या प्रचंड मोठ्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. वेस्ट विदर्भ, अमरावती, हे रिद्धपूरची जी आहे ती ऑलमोस्ट 3 to 5 लेयर्स ऑफ लँडिंगची स्टेपवेल आहे. जर वरपासून कॅल्क्युलेट केलं, भिंत जी आहे ती ऑलमोस्ट, ती जर लेअर ऑफ लँडिंग कॅल्क्युलेट केली तर ऑलमोस्ट 5 लेयर्स ऑफ लँडिंग्स आहे. आणि ही महिमापूरची आहे. सो महिमापूरची जी स्टेपवेल आहे इट इज व्हेरी सिमिलर टू स्टेपवेल इन गुजरात. इट इज 5 लेयर्स ऑफ लँडिंग स्टेपवेल्स. सो या दोन्ही स्टेपवेल्स मी महाराष्ट्र टुरिझमला ऑलरेडी फॉरवर्ड केलेला आहे विथ अ स्मॉल राईटअप, की ह्या स्टेपवेल्स अपलोड करा आणि महाराष्ट्राला पण कळून दे की आपल्या इथे खूप सुंदर स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. ह्या परत तळेगाव दशासर म्हणून आहे अमरावतीला आणि ही पवनीची आहे. परत पवनीच्या जर तुम्ही पाहिलं की गोल आहे आणि आतमध्ये चेंबर्स आहेत आणि आतमध्ये खोल्या आहेत. इट इज लाईक अ रेस्टिंग प्लेस बेसिकली. सो तळेगाव दशासरची इट इज व्हेरी सिमिलर टू द स्टेपवेल ॲट रिद्धपूर. या ईस्ट विदर्भ ऑलमोस्ट नागपूर बेल्टच्या या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत, नागपूर डिस्ट्रिक्ट मधल्या. आडासाला 3 स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. 2 सुंदर आहेत, एकाची थोडी जरा पतझड झालेली आहे, ती जरा साफसफाई केली तर ती चांगली दिसेल. रामटेक म्हणून आहे एरिया. सो रामटेक मध्ये त्या परिसरात जवळ 3 ते 4 स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. कपूर बावली पण खूप सुंदर आहे, मंदिर आहे आणि त्याच्या समोरही एक मोठी बावली टाईप आहे स्टेपवेल. सो नागार्धन किल्ला म्हणून आहे रामटेकला, तिथे 2 स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. सो ही नागार्धन फोर्टच्या आतमधली एक स्टेपवेल आहे. सो तिथे पण काही लोक आहेत, काही एनटॅकच्या 2 लेडीज आहेत, एनटॅक मध्ये काम करतात आणि त्यांचं स्वतःचं एक आर्किटेक्चरल संकुल म्हणून फर्म आहे. त्या तिकडनं सपोर्ट करतात आहेत फॉर महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल्स कॅम्पेन. आणि तिकडचं डॉक्युमेंटेशन वगैरे वगैरे सगळं मॅपिंग डॉक्युमेंटेशन ते लोक टेकअप करणार आहेत. या चंद्रपूर मधले आहेत. सो चंद्रपूरला पण काही सुंदर स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. लोकांना फक्त चंद्रपूरला गेलं की त्या साईडला ताडोबा आठवतो, ताडोब्यामध्ये वाईल्ड लाईफ सफारीला जाऊया. पण तिथे जाऊन कधीतरी स्टेपवेल्स पण बघा, अतिशय सुंदर आहेत. 3-3 मजल्याच्या 2-2, 3-3 मजल्याच्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत विथ चेंबर्स अँड यू कॅन गो राईट अप टू द वेल शाफ्ट. सो ही एक आहे चंद्रपूर सिटी मधल्याच 2 स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. लास्ट एक स्लाइड दाखवतो तुम्हाला. हे दीपोत्सव साजरा करणार आहोत महाराष्ट्रभर. लाईक 100, 150 किंवा 200 पण होतील डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द पार्टिसिपेशन. ह्या स्टेपवेलचे जे फोटोज आहेत ते ह्या वर्षीचे आहेत. मराठवाड्यामध्ये 7 ते 8 वेगवेगळ्या लोकेशन्सवर महाशिवरात्रीच्या दिवशी महाराष्ट्र दीपोत्सव साजरा झाला. आमचा एक मित्रबंधू आहेत राजेश इंगळे म्हणून, त्यांनी श्रीगोंदा तालुका अहमदनगर जिल्हा त्याच्यामध्ये भानेश्वर गाव आहे, त्याच्यामध्ये भानेश्वर मंदिराच्या बाहेरची स्टेपवेल ही त्यांनी होळीच्या निमित्त साफसफाई करून ही दिव्यांनी सजवली. मग आमचे अजून एक मित्रबंधू आहेत श्रीकांत हंडळ म्हणून, त्यांनी सुभेदार मल्हारराव होळकर यांच्या जयंती निमित्त त्यांची दौंड तालुक्यामधली एक स्टेपवेल ही फुल साफसफाई करून त्या लोकांनी ही दिव्यांनी सजवली. सो ही जी मधली जी स्टेपवेल आहे, जिथे त्यांचा एक फोटो लावलेला आहे, ती कॅन्डल्सने त्या लोकांनी फुल दीपोत्सव साजरा केला. म्हणजे जस्ट इमॅजिन करा की 100 ते 150 स्टेपवेल्स अक्रॉस महाराष्ट्र एकाच रात्री सजणार आहे. खूप मोठा सण असणार आहे महाराष्ट्रासाठी. हे भारताभर किंवा इंटरनॅशनली ही कुठेच झालेलं नाही आहे अगोदर, की आपण डायरेक्ट इंटरनॅशनल स्केलवर हायलाइट होणार आहोत. आणि त्यांनी काय होणार आहे, एका तालुक्यामधल्या जरी 2च स्टेपवेल जरी सजल्या, तरी राहिलेल्या जेवढ्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत त्या तालुक्यामधल्या, त्यांच्या लोकांना वाटेल अरे यार आपण पण साजरा करू शकलो असतो, आपण पण सहभागी होऊ शकलो असतो. मग आपण पण पुढाकार घेऊया, आपण आपापल्या तालुक्यामधल्या ज्या गावातल्या ज्या स्टेपवेल्स आहेत त्या पहिल्या साफसफाई करूया, चांगल्या ठेवूया, आणि मग इयर ऑन इयर तो नंबर जो आहे दीपोत्सवामध्ये पार्टिसिपेट करणाऱ्या लोकांचा तो वाढत जाईल. मला लिटरली त्या स्टेपवेल्स आधी जशा होत्या तशाच आता परत बघायच्या आहेत, म्हणून ह्या एवढं मोठी कॅम्पेन उभारलेली आहे महाराष्ट्रासाठी. थँक्यू.
थँक्यू रोहन, थँक्यू. खूपच छान माहिती दिलीस आणि खूप मोठं काम करतोयस. मुख्य म्हणजे 2022 मध्ये तू जो प्रपोज केलंस की आपण दीपोत्सव साजरा करू, तर नक्कीच मोठ्या प्रमाणात होईल अशी खात्री देतो. आणि आपल्या संस्थेकडनं पण जी काय मदत लागेल ते आम्ही तुला मदत करू. आणि आता पाणसकर सर हे नांदेडवरनं जॉईन आहेत आपल्या इथे, तर ते स्वतः तिथे विभाग प्रमुख आहेत, डीन पण आहेत, आणि जिओलॉजिस्ट खूप चांगले आहेत, पाण्यात काम करणारे. वेगवेगळ्या लोकांची तुला आम्ही म्हणजे जिओलॉजिस्ट त्या निश्चितच आम्ही तुला करू शकू. धन्यवाद तुला, खूपच छान झालं व्याख्यान.
नक्की नक्की.
कोणाला प्रश्न विचारा असेल तर तुम्ही अनम्यूट करून विचारू शकता.
नमस्कार.
नमस्कार.
रोहन सर, तुम्ही आता जे मांडलं स्टेपवेल बद्दल, तर ज्या स्टेपवेल मध्ये ज्याचा उद्देश होता की पाण्याची साठवण, तर मला एक असा प्रश्न पडला की त्याच्यात जे पाणी आहे त्याच्यात जर सूर्यप्रकाश आला तर ते पिण्यायोग्य राहतं का वर्षभर? पूर्वी त्यांनी जेव्हा ते बांधलं तर ते पिण्याचा उद्देश आणि वापरायचं असं दोघंही असते, तर ते सूर्यप्रकाश आल्यानंतर त्याला काही फरक पडतो का? तो पिऊ शकत होते का ते असं?
ते ऍक्च्युली आय वुड सजेस्ट जिओलॉजिस्ट टू स्टडी दिस. कारण जसं मी म्हटलं की महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल्स कॅम्पेन म्हणजे हा फक्त रोहन काळे नाही, प्रत्येक सेक्शनला त्यांची रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी घेऊन जर पुढाकार घेतला आणि स्टडी केलं तरच हे शक्य आहे. मी फक्त एक बोलतात ना की महाराष्ट्राला हे गरजेचं होतं हे करणं, कुठेतरी कोणीतरी एक फर्स्ट स्टेप घ्यावी आणि सांगावं की आपल्याला हे करायचं आहे. म्हणून मग मी मॅपिंग स्टार्ट केलं, आणि मग जिओलॉजिस्ट जे आहेत ते आणि मग लोकल जे अभ्यासक मंडळी आहेत त्यांनी हे दिलेलं जास्त बरं. कारण फक्त सूर्यप्रकाश पडून ते जे हिरवं येते, मॉस येतो, तो तेच फक्त आयडेंटिफाय करून फायदा नाही, कारण खालून सिवेज लाईन्स जातात प्रत्येकाचे. कारण मी ऑलरेडी काही GSD टीमला जेव्हा मी भेटायला गेलेलो, त्यांच्या एका सिनियर माणसांनी हे मला एक्सप्लेन करून सांगितलं की रोहन, प्रत्येक स्टेपवेलच्या खाली आज प्रचंड संख्येत सिवेज लाईन्स आहेत, ड्रेनेज लाईन्स आहेत, ते पण रेक्टिफाय करायला लागतील ह्या जर स्टेपवेल्स रिवाईव्ह करायच्या असतील तर. सो भरपूर काही काम आहे, जे म्हणून मी बोललो हे GSD ला कॉल घेऊन दे. त्यांच्याकडे एक स्ट्रॉंग मॅन पॉवर आहे, 400 फील्ड स्टाफ आहे अक्रॉस महाराष्ट्र. त्यांचा प्रत्येक जिल्ह्यात प्रत्येक तालुक्यामध्ये काम चालू आहे. सो हा डेटा ऑलरेडी भूजल विभागाला दिलेला आहे. सो लेट देम टेक अप. त्या लोकांना काही टेक्निकल स्टडी करायची असेल ते आधी करून दे, आणि मग त्या लोकांना ठरवून दे रिवाईव्ह करायच्या की किंवा रिवाईव्ह शक्य आहे की.
ओके, थँक्यू सर.
ठीक आहे.
बरोबर आहे, म्हणजे रोहन म्हणला तसं सगळं टीम वर्क, एकट्या दुकट्याचं काम नाहीच, एवढं मोठं काम आहे. आणि रोहन चॅट मध्ये पण आलेलं आहे चांगलं की गुड इन्फॉर्मेशन ऑन महाराष्ट्र स्टेपवेल्स, इंडिया स्टेपवेल्सची ही वेबसाईट केव्हा चालू होईल? ते चालू आहे,
ऑलरेडी चालू आहे. इफ यू गो www.indianstepwells.com, ती ऑलरेडी लाईव्ह आहे फ्रॉम डे 1.
त्यांनी मेसेज टाकलाय की
प्रचंड संख्येत स्टेपवेल्स बघू शकतात.
हे आता त्यात टाकलंय की आता दिसत नाही, असं चालू आहे, असं
आता दिसत नाही, आता
नाही.
आता चालू नाही येते.
टाईप www.indianstepwells.com.
हा, चालू आहे. थँक्यू.
वेलकम. दुसऱ्या स्टेटच्या पण इन्क्लूड केलेल्या आहेत त्याच्यात. जसं मी गोव्याला फिरलेलो सो गोव्याचे पण 18 स्टेपवेल्स आहेत. गुजरातच्या मी स्वतः जवळजवळ 70 स्टेपवेल्स पाहिलेले आहेत. आणि जसं विक्टोरिया मॅम बोलली की नीरव माझा पण खूप चांगला मित्र आहे. तो याच्या मागे लास्ट टाइम मी गेलेलो त्याच्या घरी पण गेलेलो, त्यांनी इन्व्हाइट.
चालेल चालेल, धन्यवाद. खूप सुंदर माहिती दिलीस. मला असं वाटतं की आजचं आपण आता सेशन थांबूयात. उद्याच्या लेक्चरची मी थोडक्यात माहिती देतो. उद्यापासून आपले संध्याकाळी लेक्चर असतात, संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता. उद्या संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता गणेश पांगारे यांचं व्याख्यान असेल. त्यांचा विषय आहे वॉटर अँड हेरिटेज, लर्निंग फ्रॉम वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज वॉटर सिस्टीम. तर उद्या संध्याकाळी 6 वाजता आपण 10 मिनिटं आधी नक्की जॉईन व्हा. आणि मॅडमने मगाशी सांगितलं तसं हा आपल्याला झूम वरती पण आहे, त्याचबरोबर युट्यूब लाईव्ह वरती पण आहे. तर त्यामुळे आपल्याला जर झूम वरती जॉईन नाही होता आलं तर युट्यूब लाईव्ह वरती पण आपण जॉईन होऊ शकता. चॅनल आपलं आहे मिशन देवराई या नावाचं आपलं युट्यूब चॅनल आहे. आणि आजचं सुद्धा लेक्चर जर रेकॉर्डेड असेल तर ते उद्या आपल्याला या चॅनलवरती बघायला मिळेल. तर ते अवश्य बघा आणि आपल्या इतरांनाही बघण्याकरता सांगा ते.